Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. What a huge pleasure to be anywhere, really. We MEPs don't get asked very often. I know we're not the most popular people in the United Kingdom, and no, don't feel you've all got to rush forward and contradict me when I say that. I've got used to this over the years. Quite how low our profile is, quite how low our status is, was borne in on me very forcefully a few months after I was elected, when a really exceptional thing happened and a constituent telephoned me. And this is almost outside the experience of an MEP. Nobody ever gets in touch. This chap called me at home. It was the number that he'd found. And he said, "Are you my MEP?" And I said, "Yes, sir, yes, I am. How wonderful to hear from you. What can I do for you?" He said, "Good, I'm glad I found you. It's my drains. They're in a frightful state. They're all blocked up. And I want to know what you're going to do about it." Of course, I didn't want to let the guy down. It's so rare that anybody ever gets in touch with their MEP about anything. So I said, "I'll tell you what, sir, you stay on the line. I'm going to give you the number of your local council. And the person you need to speak to there is the environmental health officer." "Ooh," he said, "environmental health officer? Oh, I don't think I want to take it that high." So it's without any sense of false modesty that I stand for. But I've got to tell you about the only Euro MP who doesn't have that problem. The one guy who has instant name recognition wherever he speaks. And that is a Christian Democrat colleague of mine from Luxembourg who glories in the name of Mr. Goebbels. And I will never forget the first time that Mr. Goebbels rose to speak in the chamber. And I promise you this is a true story. The man in the chair, the deputy speaker who was presiding that day, was a British Labour MEP called David Martin. And when he saw the name Goebbels on the sort of speaker board, there was a moment of pure faulty towers. You could see David Martin becoming visibly nervous. The name Goebbels was creeping up the board, and you could see the guy saying, "Don't mention the war, don't mention the war, don't mention the war." By the time it got to poor Mr. Goebbels' turn to speak, David Martin was in such a state, he said, "I now call Mr. Goering. I mean, Dr. Goebbels. Mr. Goebbels, Mr. Goebbels." But for the rest of us, as I say, wonderful to be anywhere. So thank you, True Potential. Thank you hugely for asking me, and thank you, guys. You know what? There are not many places where an MEP can go and feel that he's among an equally unpopular profession. But financial services in the UK, you might just about, over the last 6 years, have got there. So thank you for making me feel at home. And thank you, by the way, for generating all the revenue, all of you working in the private sector, that pays for all the things that we politicians do. I always think we should say that more often. You know? MPs, politicians generally, are very good at saying thank you to nurses and soldiers and teachers and police officers, and quite rightly so. But it would be nice if a little bit more often we acknowledged the people who are generating the revenue that pays for the nurses and the soldiers and the policemen and all the rest. And so thank you. You know, this is, there's a kind of spiel, isn't there, about financial services. There's a kind of thing that politicians say about, 2 million people, and it's not just London, there's Leeds and there's Edinburgh and 7% of the workforce. I don't need to convince you of that. I mean, obviously you guys know that. And you guys don't need to convince me, right? A lot of people have, especially since the crash, have had a real issue distinguishing the good, wealth-generating bits of the economy. Do you remember, we just saw a lovely picture of Ed Miliband there, the difference between the predatory and the productive businesses. Now, this is something I come across every week that I'm in Brussels. This sense that somehow what you guys do isn't real wealth-generating activity. Bashing metal for a living, that's a proper job, but moving money around isn't. Well, just think about it. It's such a weird false distinction, that, isn't it? First of all, the distinction between goods and services is a weird one. I mean, I know people make it. I know politicians make it, but why is making a tractor any more important than driving a tractor? What use would the one be without the other? And why single out one particular kind of service, which is optimizing the allocation of capital and calling it unmeritorious? There are a few things we do really well in this country, and markets is one of them. You are part of the one bit of our economy that is generating the locomotive force to drag us back into force. So I mean it. when I say thank you. Now, you're not going to hear that very often from people who work in the European Parliament. The mood there is very different. And the challenges that your industry is going to have from Brussels follow from the way in which the financial service sector generally is seen in EU institutions. And this has been something that has changed palpably since the crash 6 years ago. So most of the EU directives and regulations, up until 2008, 2009, you could certainly argue had a net liberalizing effect. That's not to say that they were all perfect, but by and large, they were prizing open markets, they were creating more of a single market in services across the continent, and therefore the countries that had to move furthest in order to comply with them were generally the more protectionist member states. Britain has a tradition of relatively light-touch financial services regulation. We were generally not the people who were having to change our domestic laws in order to comply. That changed radically after the credit crunch. And you can measure this empirically. The last 20 proposals brought forward in Brussels for financial services regulation, Britain voted against 10 of them. And actually, even that figure is a huge underestimate, because what tends to happen in these council meetings in Brussels is that if you know you're going to lose, you don't push it to a vote. There's been a huge shift in the objectives and direction of financial services regulation. In fact, you can see this by the fact that on 3 out of 4 occasions we've had to go to court and we've lost. There are now proposals being brought forward that are immediately and obviously deleterious to the UK's interests, particularly damaging to the sector where we do more trade than the rest of the EU put together, and which are in some cases malicious or envious. I'm thinking of the ban on short selling. I'm thinking of the financial transactions tax, the bonus cap, and, of course, in your industry, the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive. Now, you could blame a lot of people for the credit crunch. You can blame a lot of groups of people for the banking collapse. You can blame the banks, obviously. You can blame the credit ratings agencies. You can blame the regulators. You can blame the national governments. You can blame the central banks for keeping interest rates too low for too long and fueling the boom that preceded it. One lot of people you absolutely can't blame are fund managers. On the contrary, they were among the victims, the chief victims, and they took it on the chin. They didn't come bleating for a bailout. So why have they been subject to some aggressive legislation since, in the name of preventing another such crash? Well, one of the authors of the AIFMD told me in terms, he said, when a general brawl breaks out in the pub, you don't thump the guy who started it, you thump the guy you always wanted to thump. And that, I'm afraid, is how London and the financial services sector in Britain more widely are seen by a lot of the people that I work with. Partly, as I say, it's envy. This is not as big a sector, anything like as big a sector for any other member state of the EU. It's not a huge issue in Malta or Bulgaria. It's a cost-free thing that you can regulate. But it's also a fundamental misunderstanding of what caused our economic problems. Now, before I was elected, I was a journalist. I was a journalist for 10 years, right? I can recognize when a story has passed the point of correction. And that has happened with the idea that the financial crash was caused by deregulation. It's gone beyond the point where you can convince people. But you know what? Just for the record, I am going to say this because somebody needs to say it. You will not find, with the exceptions of nuclear power and some elements of broadcasting, you will not find a more regulated industry than financial services. The guidebook on how to comply with FCA regulations is now 1,050 pages long. This was not a crisis caused by too few rules. On the contrary, I'm going to make the argument that over-regulation not only contributed to the last crash, but is making the next one more likely. Imagine a world where there wasn't any external supervision, where people were left to their own devices and supposed to trust their own sense of responsibility. It's an amazing experiment going on in one of the Canadian provinces at the moment. It contains a big chunk of the Rockies. And the government has experimentally tried taking off the mountain roads all of the warning signs that say that there might be a landslide or there might be a sharp bend ahead, right? And so far, the experiment hasn't yet run its course, but so far, the indications are that they have caused a substantial decline in the number of accidents. Why is that? Because all those warning signs were unconsciously, subliminally lulling people into a sense that somebody else was looking after them. And so when they went for a stretch of road without any signs, without even being conscious of what was happening, they would start relaxing. And that's when the accidents were taking place. Take away all the road signs, and people start driving that much more carefully, because they know they're on their own, and they know that their safety is their own responsibility. Now, apply that to your industry. Right? We all know how it works. You buy a financial services product, and at some stage you get an email which contains a 200-word document that nobody is going to read, but that somehow creates the impression that someone somewhere is on top of all the risk. Now, is that going to make a breakdown more or less likely? That removal of a sense of direct and immediate responsibility. Go back 100 years and there was basically no such regulation. Look at the way banks and financial service product providers sold their wares, in the early years of the last century. And they would say, these are the assets we have. Banks would say, this is how much we have in terms of hard assets, and this is the interest rate we're paying. And the consumer could make up his or her mind. All right, I'll take a bigger risk here. I'm running a minimal risk of default, and I'm getting an interest rate in exchange. Do you know what? We didn't have the kind of collapse that we had 6 years ago because the system worked. I realize that what I've just said is not going to go down well with everyone in the room. Because here's a funny thing about regulation. Even when you're against it, once you've had to go through it all, you don't want the next guy to get a free ride. And so regulation, bizarrely, creates its own corpus of supporters. Once people have had to assimilate all the compliance costs themselves, and not even just the cost, but the sort of hassle of doing it, and maybe if they're a big firm, actually getting people in just to do that, well, they've then got a barrier to entry to the next competitor. The last thing they want to do is to have wasted all that effort. But nonetheless, even if you're in that category, right? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but even those of you who are, as it were, indirect professional beneficiaries of government overregulation, look a little bit more widely at the interests of the UK economy. Right? The more of this regulation we have, the further we will fall behind the emerging markets in Shanghai, in Singapore, in the Gulf, and so on. And as I say, this is one thing we do really well in the UK. It's not a sector we can afford to lose. And I'm afraid that the way we are going, in terms of our relationship with the European Union, we are at risk of losing a lot of it. I don't know if anyone saw the interview over the weekend on Hard Talk with Neil Woodford. I'm guessing this is one of the audiences where I don't need to explain who Neil Woodford is. It was headlined as warning about the risks and the uncertainty in the markets, but actually what he said was really interesting. What he said was, in the long run, we're going to have to decide whether to join the euro or leave the European Union. Because otherwise, staying where we are subject to all the regulation that's been driven by the euro process. We're being sent the bill and given all the red tape because of a currency that we declined to join. Now let's just think about that. Let's hypothesize that Neil Woodford is right, that the choice is between leaving the European Union and joining the euro. Frankly, you put it in those terms, it's got to be a no-brainer, hasn't it? Suppose we really had joined the euro 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Suppose we'd listened to Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg and the CBI and the TUC and the Unilever and Goldman Sachs and so on. I think we all know how that would have played out. And we'd have had the same boom, the same artificial credit boom here that all the other peripheral economies had, only it would have been much worse because we had exhausted our reserves during the good times. Ireland went into that crash economy cyclically and structurally very similar to ours. Ireland went into the 2000 crash running a surplus. Gordon Brown had, of course, exhausted our surplus when we were in years of growth. Britain would have left the euro, and the explosion could very well have brought down the entire system. You could manage a Greek exit as a kind of controlled explosion. Britain, that would have smashed the system to gleeds and cinders. Joining the euro, I don't think that's an option. Leaving the EU, well, since you're people working in financial services, let's look at the other Western countries with strong financial services sectors that are in this part of the world but that are not in the EU. At the top of the list is Switzerland. A very large financial services sector, not in the European Union. And you know what? I can't help noticing that they're just about getting by, the Swiss. Right? The only European country to have come through the downturn without a downturn, which is a little bit more surprising than you might think. When you bear in mind it was a banking crisis at the end of the day, right? You'd have thought the Swiss might have been pretty exposed to it. And yet, Switzerland, fifth freest economy in the world, freest economy in Europe, richest country in Europe. And not only the richest country in a direct per capita wealth sense, but the best place to be born. According to the United Nations, they do a thing called the Quality of Life Index, and they look at literacy and longevity and environment and attainment of school leavers and so on. The best country in the world. Top of the list is Switzerland. Number 2 is Norway. Spot the connection there. Plainly, some kind of life is possible outside the European Union. Plainly, it's possible to eke some miserable, wretched existence out of the cold soil, even on the fringes of the EU. Now, look, I've learned something in politics, that whenever you draw a parallel with any other country, however narrow, however technical, you are guaranteed to be told by someone, well, you can't compare us with X. You are guaranteed to be told an unrelated fact about the country that you've just cited. If I say we could learn from, Singapore's healthcare system, someone would say, yeah, well, they're a dictator. Even if it were true, so what, right? But, for those who are saying you can't compare, for those of you who are mentally saying, yeah, you can't compare us with Switzerland, all right, how about Jersey? Can I compare us with Germany? English-speaking, common law country that uses the pound and is in political union with the UK? At least let's allow that if you can't draw a parallel with the Channel Islands, you can't draw a parallel with anyone else. Now, the Channel Islands, like the Swiss, are in the common market, but outside the political structures of the EU. And again, I can't help noticing that they're managing just about to get by somehow. What does it mean? What's that alternative? And services and capital, and with some restrictions of people. The Swiss are negotiating an upper cap on numbers of EU immigrants, but by and large they have unrestricted access. But you're not in the common agricultural policy, you're not in the common fisheries policy, you pay only a token contribution to the EU budget, you're sovereign over your own laws, and here, for me, is the really key advantage. You can sign bilateral free trade agreements with countries outside the European Union. And given the way the world is now moving, that is the biggest benefit of all. Here's a little reported fact from last year. In 2014, the European Union announced that it was shelving its free trade talks with India, while the European Free Trade Association, that is Norway and Switzerland and Iceland and Liechtenstein, EFTA announced that they expect to sign a comprehensive free trade deal with India this year. Now, given that India in 2014 grew at 4.6%, while the European Union shrank by 0.3%, the Eurozone shrank by 0.9%, I would say that gives them a pretty serious competitive advantage. Now, where would Britain be better off? Is there a country in this part of the world that stands to gain more from the rising giant on the subcontinent than we do? India is, certainly for business purposes, English-speaking. It's common law. There are 1.4 million Brits of Indian origin. India is the fourth largest investor here. It owns Tetley, it owns Jaguar, but we cannot sign a free trade agreement with India or with anyone else because we gave that power to Brussels on the day we joined, the 1st of January, 1973. On the 1st of July of last year, free trade agreements came into effect between Switzerland and China and between Iceland and China. China grew at 6.6% last year. The European Union, to remind you, shrank by 0.3%. The Eurozone shrank by 0.9%. How have we, of all countries, got ourselves into a position where instead of being able to exploit the advantages of the growing, developing world, we have to wait and see whether the Italian textile producers and the French filmmakers and the steel workers in Germany are prepared to forego an element of protectionism? I mean, here we are in Manchester, in the city that invented and exported the sublime idea that we get richer, all of us, and that we prosper mutually if we're able to exchange goods and services without government regulation. It was here, among these red bricks under these grey skies, that that sublime ideal was first adumbrated, which lifted us above the run of nations, but we can't do it. Not as long as we're in the European Union. Here's a scary statistic, or at least it scared me. The year we joined, 1973, Western Europe, which I will define for these purposes as the 15 members of the EU as it stood before the eastward enlargement, before the former communist countries came in. Western Europe, in 1973, was 36% of the world economy. Today, it's 24%. In 10 years' time, it will be 15%. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the wrong place. You know, we don't sit on huge natural resources in this green, damp, exquisite island home of ours. We have to make our way in the world by what we buy and sell. And that means we have to be where the customers are. And increasingly, the customers are not in Europe. We couldn't have timed this more badly. You know, the year we joined in 1973, you looked back at 20 years of relative decline in Britain, 20 years of economic miracle in Europe. We thought, oh, this is wonderful. You know, we'd better hitch our wagon to that locomotive. We couldn't have timed it worse. Western Europe, the economic boom came to a juddering halt with the oil shock in 1974. It's never really got going again, but there has been a takeoff everywhere else, not least the common law English-speaking countries from which we had crazily stood aside. And here's the really good news. Distance has never mattered less. It's not just that shipping costs have gone down. It's that communications render distance irrelevant. It is as easy for one of you to do a deal with a company in Dunedin in New Zealand as to trade with a company in Dunkirk in France. In fact, it's easier because the Kiwi company, unlike the French one, will be English-speaking. Common law will use the same accountancy methods, will have the same unwritten business ethos. If there's a dispute between the two parties, it'll be arbitrated in a way that they both recognize. None of those things will be true of the French company, despite 40 years of the single market. Geographical proximity has never mattered less. And that's why we need to find our place in the world of today, not in the world as we thought it was going to be in the early 70s. Every continent is now experiencing economic growth except Europe. 6 years on from the crash, every other region of the world is fully recovered. North America, South America, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, the Gulf, Australia, everywhere. Everywhere except Europe. The Eurozone, incredibly, trembles on the verge of its third recession in 6 years. Everyone else has shaken off the bug. Europe alone has contracted some kind of chronic condition that it can't get rid of. Now, for a country like ours, connected by our past enterprising energies, by our family links, by our language to every other continent and archipelago, that tells me that we are in the wrong place. We've cribbed, cabined, confined ourselves in the only bit of the world that's shrinking. We can do better. And you, doing what you do as world leaders, selling financial services, you should be operating in larger markets than the ones in which we have chosen to confine ourselves. I love this argument we get that we're too small to make it outside the EU. Think of the advantages we have here. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. And we overtook France a little bit a few months ago, in the middle of last year. That's got to be worth applauding, hasn't it? Bring on the Germans. We are the 5th largest. We are the 4th military power. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. We're one of the group of 8 industrialized nations. Our languages are the most widely spoken by the human species. How much bigger do we have to be before we're able to run our own affairs in our own interests? Surely the time has come to raise our eyes to more distant horizons and rediscover that global vocation that our fathers took for granted. It's a lovely moment in the last of the Bond movies, in Skyfall, where Judi Dench is playing M. And she quotes Tennyson's Ulysses, and she applies it to our condition as a country. Though we are not now, that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. Ladies and gentlemen, if 8 million Swiss, if 5 million Norwegians, if 60,000 Channel Islanders, relying on a series of bilateral free trade agreements, are able to furnish their peoples with the highest standards of living in Europe, how much more could this country, a nation of 64 millions, a trading, maritime people, a people raised on stories of adventure in distant lands? Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are.